Chapter 5. The wind rushed past Raya's face as he soared above the clouds. It was late evening on the planet Vangelis, and from his vantage point the sunset seemed to light up the sky in golden ore. He rode alone on a vehicle called a glider. It was the floating equivalent of a motorbike, with levitation devices replacing the wheels. On this contraption one could blaze through the air at sub-max speeds, brushing against the mist and atmospheric friction with relative ease. Behind him trailed three of his friends, each riding a glider. They zoomed past one another in a vortex pattern, playing a game that had lasted them the evening. As they flew, each of them constantly tried to outdo each other. They would perform elaborate tricks, doing everything from barrel rolls and nosedives to side flips and handstands on their handlebars. Occasionally, one would fall off their vehicle and go hurling towards the world's surface. But almost as instantly as they fell, the exosuit would teleport them firmly back into their seat again without a scratch. To Raya's right flew Nabetsu. He was the only one of the group to sit out of their high-speed game. He flew in a solar sail, a kite-like object that used the photonic energy of the sun to propel it along. The device had a reclining seat that allowed him to lay back leisurely, as the sun and winds hoisted him onward. In his mouth lay a cold beverage straw that protruded from a small kegerator in the sidebar next to him. He waved to Raya as he flew beside him, blissfully enjoying the ride and observing his companion's sporadic tricks. With each and every pass through the clouds, their hysterical games grew ever more daring. There came a point where Kralik, the boldest of the group, challenged his friend Gist to a game of chicken. Immediately, the two of them killed their engines and dropped into free fall, coursing towards the surface at terminal velocity. Despite the assurance of safety that their suits provided them, it was hard to shake the feeling of imminent death. As the ground grew bigger in their periphery, one could not help but cringe at the thought of smashing into the surface. At about 10 yards from the ground, Gist sent out an emergency command, teleporting himself back into the sky. But Kralik, who had already calculated the duration of the fall and set a timer on his teleporter beforehand, waited until a millisecond before contact to disappear. "Cheater!" Gist called out when they were both back in the sky. "Hey, if you want to win this game you have to play smart," Kralik retorted, shrugging his shoulders. There was laughter all around, and after that no one dared to challenge him. The companions continued their path relatively undisturbed through the sky, until they encountered a seaward storm erupting over the ocean. A sudden gust of wind caught Nabetsu's sail and threw him back so that he almost collided with the others. The companions jeered at their friend's apparent misfortune, but came to regret their mockery as they heard the abrupt ignition of a flame from behind them. Instantly Nabetsu shot forward, giving them only moments to dodge out of the way, as he asserted himself at the head of the pack. Behind his sail were now two rockets expelling blue flame and screeching. They thrusted Nabetsu forward at a blurring speed, threatening to take him hypersonic. The others tried to mimic his pace, going full speed with their gliders, but even at maximum velocity their slender vehicles simply couldn't keep up. Now traveling at nearly 500 miles an hour, there was no sign of any of them stopping. With black clouds and the sound of thunder approaching, it was time to take the proper precautions. Raya's exosuit began wrapping around him like a suit of armor, preparing and protecting him from the elements he soon would encounter. There would be an explosion as he broke Mach, and at this speed even hitting a drop of water would feel like a slap in the face. With something more concrete like a piece of ice or hailstone, which were frequent this time of year, contact with the naked body could mean certain death. Raya looked down, and noticed his friend Sidarius fingering a remote device from his pocket. It was cylindrical in shape, graded in texture, and contained the image of a large thunderbolt carved onto its side. "Oh no, not this again," Raya thought to himself, hysterically. Sidarius gripped the device and aimed it at Nabetsu. It fed off the static friction between the air and the clouds, and when it built a sufficient charge it could be fired off, unleashing a bolt of lightning across the sky. Such a strike could temporarily disable any of their ships through electrical failure, and if one did not properly defend themselves they would surely crash into the ground. Immediately Nabetsu felt a sting as his solar sail was struck. He dropped out of the sky and began racing in free fall as Sidarius went for another shot. This time he struck Gist, who had been unobservantly looking the other way. By the time the others were aware of what was happening, they too were falling out of the sky. Within moments they had revived their gliders, however, and were summoning lightning devices of their own. What ensued next was an eruption of thunder and sonic bombardment that echoed off in the night. The companions fired bolts at each other that ripped across the sky, which, while hilarious, was probably not the best choice with respect to the indigenous peoples on the ground. The companions were up there, starting a lightning storm for their own entertainment. But for the Vangelis civilians who had not mastered climatology nor modern physics, such an act must have been magic, even godly. They would have no doubt looked like the deities of old throwing thunderbolts for sport. And between the sonic booms, roaring engines, and hysteric laughter that could be heard up above, it was a wonder the Vangelis even put up with tourists at all. It of course had not always been this way. Initially, the Vangelis did not care for human beings. They were skeptical of human spacecraft, and even more so of their motivations. When mankind approached the planet 300 years ago with offers of gifts and knowledge, the Vangelis took it as a slight. They were a proud people, heavily industrialized themselves, and did not care at all for the humans' perceived condescension. In truth, the humans had not wanted to articulate a sense of superiority in their correspondence. It was only by happenstance that a failure in communication created a major diplomatic meltdown. For years the Vangelis banned all communication between their planet and the interstellar community. They viewed their planet as the apex of cultural purity, and so felt that there was nothing of value that could be attained by trading knowledge with the broader cosmos. This sentiment quickly changed, however, when an incoming solar flare threatened to devastate the planet's atmosphere. With the Vangelis astronomers warning their leaders of an incoming disaster, the world's nations mobilized an effort to defend themselves. Through collaborative programs, they designed a radiation shield that was believed to mitigate the harsh effects of a solar flare. If 90% of the blast could be absorbed, they believed, it would cause only minor malfunctions at home. With this in mind, they crafted a shield, hoping to have it up and running by the end of the year, but design failures caused many of the launches to fail. While they tried to repeatedly rebuild the massive shield, their attempts were met with similar failure and time was running out. It was in this last moment of hidden desperation that the Vangelis finally opened up a line of communication with the human diplomats. Approximately 3 minutes and 30 seconds after their first call, the peacekeepers appeared in orbit, setting up a perimeter between them and the overactive star. The humans saved the planet by making alterations to the star's core, averting the disaster. And when the Vangelis were finally assured of their safety, public attitudes began to change. Even amongst the leadership of Vangelis, there was a sentiment that the humans were owed something. The Vangelis public concurred with this philanthropic sentiment, and so they picked a beautiful lot of coastal land upon which to open an embassy where humans were permitted. Around this embassy grew the city of Dengzichen. It was a community that served as a bridge between the two species, thought it was mainly used as a vacation spot in the modern day. As Raya flew over the city, he could see the statue of Anakil Sindar, the peacekeeper who had answered the call during the Vangelis' most desperate hour. It was truly an image of humanity in their best light. A constant reminder that although their species had flaws, not all of them were as foolhardy as the tourists. Raya wished one day to perform such a heroic feat. For now, however, he was hungry. And with the sun setting even further on the horizon, he thought it best to call it a day. "You hungry?" he called out to them telepathically over the howling wind. "Yeah, I'm getting there," Nabetsu responded. "Wanna go to Salzario's?" he pointed upward. "Sounds good to me." The others concurred and turned their gilders upwards against the current of the sky. They flew higher and higher onward until the world's surface was no longer in sight. Just above the higher set of clouds hovered a lone platform in the sky. It was stationary, unmoved by the wind, and glimmering in fine architecture that looked to be carved from stone and silicon. Upon the circular platform was a parkway to stash their gliders. Beyond that, an automated restaurant for recreational sky dwellers. When the companions entered Salzario's, they were met by an elaborate assembly of carts and stands. It was like a market without the merchants, a food court without a waiting line. Here, unmanned manifestarians cranked out dishes of all flavors and varieties without the need for currency. It was free and delicious. Upon stovetops, fresh roasts and boiled soups filled the air with zesty aroma. By the snack table, wine, crackers, cookies, and an assortment of cheeses lay fresh for the picking. On one of the stands laid countless lines of professionally rolled sushi. And on another was more pizza than any of their intestinal bots could ever recycle. The group sat down at a vacant table and examined the holographic menu. It was nothing more than a suggestion list, truly. Anything they desired, regardless of complexity or rarity, could be manifested onto their plates with just a thought. One could recall a home-cooked meal by their mother 40 years ago and expect an exact replica meal of identical taste. Any dish one desired could be reproduced accurately down to the last atom. And for those who needed help choosing, the internal algorithm of the menus could examine one's taste buds for clues to their preferences. Before the meal began, the men started out with a toast. "To long life and a million adventures still," Nabetsu proclaimed. They put their glasses forward, and when all had touched, each was spontaneously filled with their drink of choice. Raya took a sip of Zatan milk while Gist gulped down 3 glasses of juice. Nabetsu was having what looked like orange soda, whereas Kralik was drinking what could not be mistaken for anything other than liquor. They drank at the table, laughing and remarking on stories of old, and when finally they had decided to make their order, the dishes appeared just as quickly as their drinks had. As they dined, the robotic service bots offered them a plethora of entertainment. There were cards and tabletop games stored underneath their table, and around them various monitors broadcast stations from all over the universe. On one monitor played an old movie that was considered a classic by the Teravonian film critics. Another covered a T-Kung-G tournament, while yet another still showed a news broadcast from somewhere in interstellar space. Raya, however, paid little attention to the screens, as he viewed them as distractions. He preferred the intimate conversation of his friends, and had learned long ago the faultiness of being overstimulated. By the time night came around, their talking had slowed and their guts were stuffed. Finally, in guilty satisfaction, the 5 of them stood up from the table, pushed in their chairs, and went out the exit doorway. As they departed the restaurant, they were pleased to be met by an exquisite display of nighttime starlight. At this altitude, there were no clouds to block their view, nor light pollution to dull their vision. They were alone at night before a bare, unfiltered sky, and to Raya it was entirely captivating. Nabetsu sat on the edge of the floating platform and let his legs hang over the side. Raya joined him, and with a glass still in hand, toasted Nabetsu, remarking on all their years of friendship. "You know, we've vacationed here 100 times before, and it never seems to get old," Raya remarked. "And we shall 100 times more," Nabetsu exclaimed. "To an eternity of adventure." They both drank heavily, and then ceremoniously spat off the edge of the platform. Nabetsu laughed heartily, and then dug into the pocket region of his exosuit. Out of his pocket he drew a strange leafy substance. It was green like any other common leaf, save for the gold stripes stretching up the length of its stem. Within this plant was a mix of many floral lineages. It contained the genetic insertions of tobacco, cannabis, sage, mint, and a variety of plants found only on New Gaia. Nabetsu stuck the substance into his pipe, then shaped his hand in a gun-like motion, erupting flame from his pointer finger. He lit the substance effortlessly, then put the pipe to his mouth and began to inhale. "It's smooth. I made it myself. Here, try." Raya put the pipe to his mouth, and found that the smoke was thin and easily ingestible. To his novice lungs there was not even a need for a cough. He felt a jolt of glee spring up in his body as the psychoactive effects kicked in. Luckily for him, however, it did not become mentally transformative. Raya relaxed in a blissful quasi-sober state, and sat in silence long enough for his uncomfortable thoughts to return. "Do you really think we'll be doing this stuff forever, man?" he asked abruptly. "Forever? I don't know. I hope so. Realistically, though, do you see us coming back here 100 years from now?" "Yeah. 1,000. Yes. 1,000,000. Nabetsu peered at him concernedly. "Why are you asking me this?" Raya shrugged his shoulders. "The first time I rode a glider, it was the most amazing thing in the world. You couldn't keep me off it. It was spectacular. Now, after 60 years of riding the thing, it just feels normal. I don't know, it just doesn't give me the same rush it used to. Well, of course, everything is more exciting when it's new. Yes, but isn't that the problem? We humans get bored too easily. How are we supposed to live an infinite number of years if our passions are so quick to dull? Raya, look above you for a second. There's more stars out there than we can even begin to count. Most of them have planets too. How could you ever think you'd get bored when living amongst such an endless expanse? The universe is big. He agreed. But forever is a long time. It's more than a long time, Raya. It's so long that to explore it all would take a number of years we don't even have a word for yet. It would take so long that new worlds would sprout up before you could explore the old, and your journey across the stars would never end. That is true. But what's the point in walking the cosmos endlessly? What's the point of an eternal life? Raya's fatalistic outlook was beginning to frustrate Nabetsu. You're thinking way too hard about this. Just take life as it comes. If there's something to worry about in the future, worry about it then. No need to stress now over a problem that may or may not ever come. You're right, he said, returning his focus to the present. Here, give me another puff of that. Raya inhaled strongly, nearly coughing. That's the spirit. Nabetsu laughed. The night went on with continued games and frequent hysterics, and when finally the companions returned to the surface they made camp on a patch of soft grasses next to the beach. The ocean waves crashed against the rocks, creating a rhythmic noise that was complemented by the mellow breeze. They did not pitch tents nor wear blankets for warmth. Instead they lay uncovered in the sand, and let the feeling of the unfettered ground encapsulate them. His four companions drifted off unconsciously without a thought in the world. Raya, however, could not do that just yet. He tossed and turned beside the twilight surf, lost in anxious thought. The only thing that seemed to calm him was the nature around him. And so, in an effort to calm himself, he looked to the sky once more. He soothed himself by shifting his visual spectrum every 30 seconds or so. At first he watched the stars in the traditional visible light spectrum, then he switched to ultraviolet and noticed the distinct color change. After that he switched to thermal. And then to radio. And then back again. With each change his visual spectrum came a vastly different perspective on the universe. It was incredible to think that all these different photons had traveled trillions of miles across the cosmos, only to end their journey at his eyes. It reflected a scope of being that was beyond understanding. A grandiose interstellar body of which he was somehow a part of. Entranced by the vivid colors and various wavelengths of this photonic barrage, he finally struck the stress-inducing memories from his head. In his peace he fell into slumber, resting beside the waters. It was a long dreamless sleep. One that he'd lacked for a while. But more than a rest, it was a peaceful thing. A long reprieve from his waking mind. They awoke bright and early the next morning, eager for another adventure. Before sunrise the companions were already standing at the base of Mount Fukihoro, and as the sun began to creep over the horizon they began their ascent upward. The hiking trail would take them across the entire distance of the Ginwa mountain range. It was a scenic route they'd taken twice already, and with good weather they might even be able to see the forbidden lands of Old Vangelis in the distance. Aiding their trip through the hot summer sun was a forest of ornately colored land coral. The companions walked in the shade of these mounds, following a trail that had been blazed by past tourists. On the sides of the coral stalks one could see tiny mites emerge from their inner burrows. They crawled around, secreting a goo that would eventually form new stems and branches as it hardened. Below the land coral were long patches of growths known as megaferns. These were great plants twice the size of men that housed marsupial creatures scurrying about underneath. Though there were no birds to fill the skies, there were arthropodic creatures called crusoes that flew from peak to peak. The creatures had what looked like the body of a shrimp and the wings of a bat, and flew in long flocks, feeding off the tops of the tender forest and trying to evade the predators that hid within. Raya took a detour into the woods, hoping to make a new discovery, and noticed a hairy-fanged creature called a dozum hanging from a megafern nearby. He tried to approach the creature, but as soon as it locked eyes with him it scurried away into its burrow out of sight. When finally they came above tree line, their path was characterized by dark sand and towering red rock. Along the range were stone mounds and graffiti carvings made by previous travelers, yet as they trudged miles further the markings became increasingly scarce. Every time it seemed like the companions were at the peak of the tallest summit, they would turn their heads to find yet another summit still. The hike took them well into the cold weather altitudes, forcing their exosuits to thicken as the frost wind blew against them. At this point, Dengzhichen was no longer in sight. It was not until they reached Grey Peak of Mount Mertenihall that they stopped for a break. Manifesting before them was a quilt, a basket, and an assortment of picnic snacks. Their lunch consisted of traditional nuts and raisins as well as the synthetic nature bars designed in off-world labs. Raya sat on the quilt chewing one of these bars, when he heard Kralik call out to them from a lookout point above. "That's it. Over there." Kralik pointed to a group of settlements in the distance. At once the companions got to their feet, and gathered around to see the forbidden lands in plain view. "Let's go down there just for a quick peek," Jis said. "You know we can't," Nabetsu retorted. "What if we turned invisible? I heard Jard and Raj did it last year and it looked way cooler up close." "I'm sure it did. But if we get caught, it'll be our faces on all the warning signs. I don't want us to be on the news for breaking the truce on behalf of our entire species." "Oh fine," Gist accepted reluctantly. "You're quite the buzzkill, you know that." "I know. I'm just making sure we don't lose the privilege to come back here." It was clear that Gist still wanted to protest, but unfortunately Nabastu's reasoning was clear. After finishing their long lunch on the sunny rocks, they packed their belongings and left. The way back to Dengzhichen was not nearly as exciting as the way up. Between the moderate soreness that Raya had accumulated in his legs, and his frequent tendency to drift off in thought, he found himself trailing behind at the back of the group. He walked carefully down the mountain, trying not to trip over loose rocks, when suddenly he noticed something troubling. "Stop," Raya said, freezing the group in their tracks. "What is it?" Nabetsu asked. "I'm counting only 4 of us, where's Gist?" They all looked around. "Gist?" Kralik called out. There was no response. "Where did that rascal wander off to?" "I think you know where," Raya said. A sudden look of realization appeared on Nabetsu's face. "He didn't." Raya chuckled. "Oh, I'm afraid he did." Nabetsu stomped off in anger and then promptly disappeared. In an instant he was back on the grey peak of Mount Mertenihall shouting for his friend. There was no sign of Gist in the extended mountain basin, so he adjusted his view through all the visual spectrums until he saw a clearly invisible Gist sneaking towards the forbidden Vangel city. Nabetsu turned similarly invisible, and then teleported out in pursuit, hoping to grab him before he could make a disturbance. Gist, who was still seeing in the traditional spectrum, walked directly into him. He fell with a thud, confused as to what had struck him, and then felt the texture of cold hands begin dragging him back up the side of the cliff. A moment later, he was no longer in the forest but relocated on top of the mountain among friends. "I respect your attempt," Nabetsu said. "But don't do it again." For the remainder of the hike they walked in relative silence. Their path grew warmer as they declined in altitude, and when they reached the end of the trail they decided to take a quick sojourn through the city. Dengzhichen was an elaborate mix of cultures. Unlike the rest of the planet, it was a city where humans and Vangels coexisted together in peace. On one street you might see the spherical buildings typical of Vangel architecture, while on another you'd see the towering high-rises and elaborate gardens typical of humanity. The streets, as they walked upon them, did not appear to be sufficiently paved. They contained loose dirt and gravel suited for the grip of the Vangel's many appendages. The creatures themselves had 6 limbs to move. 2 skinny arms with long pointed fingers, and 4 webbed feet that created a galloping motion as they ran. The Vangels of lower class were made to crawl on all 6s like a beast. But the higher class Vangels, with their elaborate beads and necklaces, walked upright with a ceremonial walking stick. Upon each of their backs they adorned thin cloaks of a reflective material, which protected their pale grey skin from the summer sun. At first Raya believed them to be a race of exclusively bearded men. But as he came to realize later on, the women shared facial hair of nearly equal length. What really made the Vangels stand out from other creatures, though, was the asymmetry of their face. On the left side they had 3 nostril ports that doubled as a mouth and esophagus, and on the right side was a single compound eye that contained thousands of little lenses poking out in all directions. One thing Raya had not expected from the beautiful look of the city was the terrible way it smelled. The strong odors hit his nose in wafts that grew only worse as they entered the heavily populated districts. He feared it was the result of improper waste disposal, but once he saw their well-kept sewers and streets, he realized it was something else. The Vangelis, like many creatures on the planet, communicated entirely through chemical signaling. The disgusting odors floating through the air were not of rot or excrement, but rather signaled words, memories, and sometimes even advertisements for the local shops. The setup between buyers and sellers in the streets demonstrated the efficiency of the Vangel market economy. While humans were in a post-scarcity system without money nor the need for it, the Vangelis were not. You could tell by the mere size of a commoner which had eaten today and which hadn't. You could see in their worn faces which had labored that morning and which had lived luxuriously. Through the barrage of stinking odors and foul smells, Raya did eventually pick up a pleasant fragrance. He turned his head to discern its origin, and found a Vangel street vendor standing by the road carrying a basket of some unknown fruit. Curious as to its taste, he signaled to the vendor his desire to buy. As he approached, an invisible cloud of hydrogen sulfide expelled from the vendor's nostrils. The gases came in coded waves that were alien and hard to understand, but with the help of his exosuit he interpreted the chemical messages clearly. Exchange. The creature seemed to be saying through its odor signal. Raya pulled out a golf ball-sized diamond and offered it to the vendor. The vendor felt it in his hand, sniffed it, and then returned it back to him. A new smell arose, one that the chemical decipherer read as negative. Raya contemplated a response. If they were not into shiny objects as most visual creatures were, what kind of currency could he exchange? He recalled learning in his youth about a flower that had evolved to smell like rotting flesh. The biologist said it would attract flies and dung beetles alike. Perhaps in this situation it could do the same. But what was it called? He thought about it for a moment. It starts with a sea carnation. Kaluna? No. He thought. Carrion. It's the carrion flower. An image of the repulsive plant appeared in his head. He then sent this image to the manifester beneath his arm, and watched as the flower appeared in his palm. The Vangel vendor eyed the flower curiously, sniffed it, and then signaled to him its apparent delight. The vendor then tried to offer Raya the entire basket in gratitude, but he declined. Just one thank you. He responded in chemical signals. The vendor bowed its head and passed it to him. Raya bit into the mystery fruit, and almost instantly regretted his purchase. The sour juices gave it a bitter taste, and the encompassing acid stung the inside of his mouth. Without the exosuit to help him digest, it probably would have damaged his insides. Even with the suit's protection, it was clearly no treat. Raya waited until he was just beyond the view of the merchant, and then spat the fruit out into the trash. So much for my curiosity, he thought. He continued walking down the length of the strip until he stopped at a local billboard. Due to the Vangelis' lack of written language, they had to use all sorts of colorful imagery to express their intentions. On each sign was an image of human activity that was colored either orange or violet. The orange signs portrayed actions such as littering, spitting, or unwanted physical contact as deeply prohibited, while the violet signs portrayed actions such as trading, eating, and swimming as openly encouraged. Theft was also a concept they had to continually remind the tourists about, for while humans were used to taking or replicating anything they found pleasant, the Vangelis would aggressively snap at any unwarranted touching of their items. Living in a pre-utopian society was often difficult to adjust to. But if one wanted to live in Deng Xichen, they were expected to be considerate of the local norms. Raya noticed people stopping on the sidewalk up ahead, and curiously went to investigate it. Here he found his friends waiting in line for a local event popularly known as the Kaljuka. The Kaljuka was one part art show, one part festival, and one part dance. There were more Vangel food carts here than he'd ever seen before, and on an elevated platform a group of the creatures were setting up some sort of entertainment device. The Vangelis were not auditory creatures, so rather than dance to music they gathered around a spinning crystal that refracted all colors of light through an ever-moving prism. It was odd watching them move around in silence without any beat to guide them, But as Raya observed closer, he began to notice a pattern. The refracted light would turn from one color to another, and then back again, creating a visual rhythm that guided their various movements. Red, green, blue. Red, green, blue. Red, green, blue. Red, green, blue. As the colors changed from red to green, so did their foot motions. When the prism flashed blue, many of them twirled. In addition to the light show, there was an encirclement of tightly fit aroma machines that filled the air with unsavory smoke. They were well placed throughout the city street and walls, attracting new attendees with their repulsive odors. Raya and his companions had fun trying to take part in the silent dance, but this feeling quickly changed when one of the big bearded creatures approached Sidarius. It groaned in a perverse manner and waved its staff about. "I think it wants to dance," Jis teased. Sidarius looked at the creature uncomfortably, and then back to them. "Is it even a woman?" "Doesn't really matter, unless you plan on kissing it," Nabetsu jeered. They each laughed, causing the Vangel dancer to pause and stare at them more attentively. It was no doubt trying to decipher the intention of their outward noises, but it lacked the sensory organs to make sense of their language. It advanced once more, waving its staff again, when a long drip of saliva expelled from its face. "I think it's time to go," Sidarius called out to them telepathically. The companions followed him with haste, making it to the exit while trying their hardest not to come off disrespectful. In truth, the Vangel elder had not meant to startle the humans with his friendly gesture of dance. It was only due to the language barrier that they misunderstood his intentions. Outside, the city streets were now immersed in a misty haze. Few paid attention to the tourists as they rushed out. By the time they'd fully traversed Dengzichen and returned to their camp, the tides were out and the sun was beginning to set in the sky. At the coastline between the city and the sea, Raya bid his companions farewell. They packed their camp neatly, teleporting each piece of luggage into their orbiting starships. And when every tent, glider and fire starter was gone without a trace, they too teleported out of sight. The last to leave was Nabetsu, who brought his ship all the way to the beach before departing. He scooped up a handful of the Vangel sand and put it in a glass jar as a souvenir. "Until next time," Raya told him, going in for a brotherly hug. "Till we meet again," Nabetsu replied, vanishing after releasing from the embrace. Raya watched the ship take off and followed it with his eyes until it was completely out of sight. Then he was alone. A single man on the beach without a clue in the world. With his friends now gone, the eerie details of his situation became more apparent. He was again confronted with his lonely predicament, and it pained him greatly. Each of his friends had left because they had lives to attend to, passions to follow, responsibilities to bear. What was he doing? He had assured each of them that he too would return to New Gaia, but that was a lie. Why would he return home from his destiny walk when he had nothing to show for it? He stood once again in contemplation, wrestling with the eternity that was his life. The familiar sea had a way of evoking nostalgia, reminding him of friends and places long past. Already he could feel those close to him growing more distant, and in time what was an unbreakable bond would become only a distant memory. He wondered now if there had ever been a point to his adventures. If his thrills had any meaning to them, or if they were simply meant to keep him distracted from a meaningless existence. There was no clear answer apparent to him, and so he turned back to the city in search of mindless entertainment.